and welcome to episode 112 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is Jon Denning in Los Angeles.
John, this is a special surprise episode of the podcast, one that I didn't expect to be doing, and I don't think you did either.
No. In fact, surprise is probably the word of the day, or at least the theme of this. Although I will say, a little less surprising perhaps for us than for the listeners out there, as we'll discuss.
Yes, and let me start off by saying that first off, this is not the full LSAT recap podcast that we do on the regular after every test. So we're not going to talk about the test content or scale predictions. We'll do that in just a couple of days after the international and paper and pencil test takers have finished their administrations. Instead, we're going to talk about the special research section that was given to some, but not all test takers on Saturday as they arrived at section 4 of their test.
That's right. Yeah, so for anyone waiting on that test recap, consider this a little, appetizer or something to hold you over till we get to the main course. But this in and of itself, I think, definitely deserves a discussion. This was a big deal.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the point. We felt it was a big enough deal. We may see it again in the future that we wanted to have a shorter standalone episode on this. So it's kind of like a mini emergency shortened episode that we will have an abbreviation, as it were. So the first question is, of course, what are you drinking?
Yeah, well, this will, I think, clarify the urgency we felt. We didn't even wait until nighttime to do this. It is the middle of the day for us both. So I am drinking a good old-fashioned Americano. Just a coffee with a shot of espresso. And after the weekend we had, I think we both could caffeinate endlessly today and still not get enough.
Yeah, and I wish I could say that the weekend was out partying all the time, but no, it was inside doing the LSAT party on Friday, Saturday, and then on Sunday as well.
Yeah, it turns out.
Just putting it all together.
So what are you drinking?
Coffee. I'm actually drinking a new kind of old favorite. I'm a fan of Monster Energy Zero Ultra. I think I've had that multiple times on past episodes.
Yeah.
Turned on many of my friends to it. But now they've come out with a ton of flavors, so I'm actually drinking the Peachy Keen version of it. So you, as a Georgia boy, should appreciate the peach flavoring of this.
I do. I'd say I'll appreciate it a lot more, and publicly, if we could ever get that Monster Energy sponsorship deal. That's got to be like any day now.
Marketing's got to get on that, because seriously, we do promote them for free constantly.
There you go. Well, given the oddball nature of what a lot of students encountered, and again, that we're going to explore, we also went with a good old Doors song here. The song is Strange Days, which I thought was pretty fitting. Maybe Strange Day in this case, because Saturdays where the oddity happened. But good tune, a throwback, and certainly topical.
Great tune, classic. From a song standpoint, I prefer People Are Strange, but Strange Days is more applicable to what Saturday was for many test takers.
Strange days have found us, as they say.
Indeed they have. And since this is an abbreviated version of the podcast, we're going to jump right to the discussion, and we'll talk about the LSAT world in the next episode. So, John, what was it that actually happened on Saturday?
Yeah, for a little context or backstory, people that don't realize this, for ages, and again, I'll give a little history to this, for ages, certainly since the flex test turned into the 4-section current version, re-added an experimental section as one of those 4. One of your sections on this test has been unscored essentially for research purposes. They use it to test out future questions, but it doesn't count for you. It doesn't count against you. Your performance isn't factored in. It's simply for their own internal use for future test creation. So for the longest time now, we've had this essentially mystery section out there. It's a duplicate of something else. So you'll have 2 logical reasonings, 2 reading comps, 2 logic games, perhaps. It's completely randomized and it's completely mysterious. It can be any of your 4 sections. The only thing you can do as you're taking the test is spot a duplication. But even then, you still wouldn't know which one counted or not. So in real time, you basically are taking 4 sections as though they count. It's your only hedge or safe bet. What happened on Saturday was a departure from this, and a singular departure. I can't recall this ever occurring before. Can you? Are you familiar with this ever happening historically?
Yeah, I recall them doing some comparative reading testing ages ago. This would have been over a decade ago at this point.
15 years now. This month, in fact.
Yeah, they slipped it into the experimental section, but comparative reading is so similar to regular reading that I don't recall them actually putting a notification saying it was experimental at that time. And I don't believe they did.
Yeah, and there were months and months of documentation and publications about the fact that they were testing this new thing out. What happened on this past Saturday was slightly different. As we approached mid-afternoon or early afternoon, what we started to see was that about half of the people taking the test reached their fourth section and had all three types at that point, and then were met with a notification, almost a disclaimer, that the section they were about to attempt, section 4, would not count, was going to be experimental, was for research purposes, and that told them right away, before they even went into it, that the 3 they had done were real, and the one they were about to do is not, or would not be. We'll get into the content of the section, but as a sort of context or structure, that's the way that this unfolded.
Yeah, and as you can imagine, there were a number of people who immediately thought something's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't be seeing this. It doesn't make sense. And so they started asking questions along the lines of, is this legitimate? Was this intentional? And in fact, it was intentional and legitimate. That they weren't lying to you, as it were. It was not scored.
I didn't keep count, but I got that question directly from people through Reddit and Twitter and our forum, even some who had my email and things, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 100 times on Saturday afternoon. What happened? My test broke. Do I need to call LSAC? Did Proctor U do this to me? Which is usually an obvious candidate. These concerns were understandable because, number one, it's completely unique to have this experience. And number two, as we'll talk about, there was no warning. No one was told the night before, or at least students weren't told the night before the morning of, that they might encounter this.
Exactly.
Let's talk about what they did actually encounter. What was in the section itself, because I think that's important too.
Yeah, if I recall, it was tagged as a logic game section or research section, and it was kind of a simplified version of logic games, or in some cases, almost close to logical reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
Logic games that weren't as complex as normal games didn't have as many questions, typically had 3 questions, maybe 4 in some instances. And knowing now what the content of each one of the various items that they tested, because they had different sections for different people, they still look a little bit like logic games. They're just not as involved in most cases. Depends on, how your interpretation of the situation is. But most interestingly is, let's say you had kind of a simplified game presented first, and then you had a couple of questions. After you reached, say, question 3, you were met with survey questions. And the survey questions were very intent upon figuring out how you use scratch paper, if at all, and whether or not you found it beneficial. And so in the aftermath, and this is funny because beforehand, I was under the impression that what they were about to test was a whole slew of new item types.
Right.
And in the aftermath, it was clear to me that they were actually trying to determine exact levels of scratch paper usage, the perceived benefit, and then they'll go back and compare that to the success that students had on individual items. So anybody who had one of these end up having more survey questions than actual LSAC questions. In fact, if you had 9 actual LSAC questions, you ended up with 18 survey questions connected to each one in total. So 2 survey questions for each LSAC question that you did. But because of the simplified nature of the section, what you ended up with was people finishing this in like 10 minutes.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. That once people realized what was happening, or at least had some conception of what was happening to them, the biggest complaint that I often heard from people is my proctor wouldn't let me leave with 18 minutes left on the clock. And so that was the gripe about the section. The structure of it, though, as you say, it really was like 3 mini logic games, some almost approximating or closer to like a logical reasoning stimulus, something you get in a must-be-true question with conditional reasoning, say.
Formal logic.
I interpret it differently, and you're probably right, as usual. And you guys heard that on tape, so there it is.
Yes, it's true.
I thought it was 2 survey questions per game set, but you're saying it's 2 survey questions per question for each one.
Like, think back to question number 1, 2 questions about scratch paper. Let's go to question 2, questions about scratch paper, 1 and 2, and so on.
That's even more tedious than I thought, and I already didn't like this.
Yeah, and there were preset answers, so it wasn't like you were writing an essay on this. Right. Like you were able to go through the selection, which Thankfully, we have, and they're not that useful, really. They're very much pointed towards figuring this out. And we'll get into why they might be asking about the usage of scratch paper specifically in connection to analytical reasoning in a moment. But from anybody who thinks, well, did those test takers get an advantage by seeing this research? Absolutely not. There was nothing in the research section that was inherently useful to future test takers, at least as far as like direct content or anything along those lines.
Yeah, the content wasn't advantageous. Yeah. Other things we'll discuss possibly were. So this is clearly related to logic games. They're clearly investigating and doing some very preliminary research, pre-testing on possible directions they could go with logic games. So I think the next question to naturally ask is why? Why did they do this?
What are they doing? I mean, one answer is, well, LSAC is constantly looking for ways to improve the LSAT. It is the gold standard of tests, after all. And they want to do everything within their power to make it the best possible test for today and for tomorrow.
Oh, God. I assume your check's in the mail.
Of course it's in the mail. That was also sarcasm
yes,
in case someone out there didn't pick it up.
Check will bounce.
But I might have a job with them at the end of this. Who knows? Kidding. I do not have a job with them. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'd be the last person they'd hire. So there is that possible theory, but there's a much more plausible theory, and that is that if you go back several years, and if you're interested, the background on this is in episode 30 of our podcast. We talk about whether or not there's a future where logic games will disappear from the LSAT. And going back into 2019, there was a lawsuit versus LSAC, and the plaintiff's name was Angelo Bino, and there was someone else in there as well. And Mr. Bino was sight impaired and sued LSAC saying that the LSAT discriminated against him. And he prevailed because, of course, his argument was, well, reading comp and logical reasoning I can do without scratch paper and visual diagrams, but I can't do logic games without them. And it's hard to argue against that point. I'd have to agree that scratch paper is pretty essential. It's something that we advocate everybody use when attacking logic games. But if you have sight issues, that's going to be a real problem. So he had a completely legitimate grievance. And as the case went through, that was really borne out. And so an agreement was ultimately made with LSAC. And when you take a look at the consequences of the Bino lawsuit, LSAC finally made an announcement. It was very soft in terms of what they were saying, but I'll read part of it right here. I won't read the whole thing because that would be boring for all of us. It says, LSAC has begun research and development into alternative ways to assess analytical reasoning skills. As part of a broader review of all question types to determine how the fundamental skills for success in law school can be reliably assessed in ways that offer improved accessibility for all test takers. So that's the first thing that's interesting there is, hey, we've begun research into alternative ways to assess analytical reasoning. That's what logic games are. So continuing on with LSAC's statement, consistent with the parties' agreement, that means between LSAC and Bino, LSAC will complete this work within the next 4 years, which will enable all prospective law students to take an exam administered by LSAC that does not have the current AR, analytical reasoning section, but continues to assess analytical reasoning abilities. So essentially what they were saying, and kind of they made a different statement where they kind of softened it even more. Yeah. They said that their goal was to complete the research within 4 years. So that would be 2023, 2024, depending upon your exact timeline for when everything starts. Well, here we are, and you can see it's the middle of 2022. If you're engaged in research, you're probably going to have to put it out into the public and test it a little bit. So it's clear that they're starting to ask questions about this process, and you have to think that it is connected to this.
Yeah.
Now, does this mean for certain that logic games will go away from the LSAT? No, it doesn't. In fact, there's a world in which logic games is there for most students, and perhaps, depending upon the way certain things line up at the end, one of the accommodations is you get an alternative analytical reasoning section that does not require diagramming the way current logic games do. So this isn't a discussion of whether or not games is on the test in the future or not. That is what we talk about in podcast episode 30. But I will say this, nothing's going to change for like 2 years here, if something is going to change at all.
Note the timing of this. I mean, they put this statement out 3 years ago, And only now are we seeing them even begin to field test the first, most preliminary versions of alternatives. And frankly, those, I'm doing air quotes around alternatives that no one can see, these like little mini games that they were doing, no one's going to be struck by the novelty of this. The only thing novel about them is how watered down and simplified they were.
Yeah, some of them were harder than others. Some of them weren't that difficult at all. I can say this, for those of you who didn't get this section of research, everything else in terms of like, knowing it's experimental and so forth being set aside, this was a section that most people would like to see scored because it was so easy. Yeah. I think most people would be like, I got all of them, or at least most of them, and it was shorter. They would have liked this to have been a real section, and it was not. But this is what LSAC does as they move forward. They have to test some items out there, and they have to ask certain questions. So nothing's going to change in the next 12 to 18 months. If there's going to be changes, the understanding is that there would be very adequate notice, something we'll cover a little bit more later, I imagine, and everyone would know before walking into the test that a change was occurring.
Yeah, this does not qualify as adequate notice.
No, and that's because this wasn't real. That's the key thing. Since it was unscored, they didn't really honestly care all that much. In fact, one of the things that happened is they did tell us that this was coming because they wanted, I think, the aftermath of this to have like a reasonably controlled narrative. Mm-hmm. And, we posted a blog on it on Saturday night, answering all sorts of questions that a lot of people were able to read and be like, okay, so it was normal. And I think that's the kind of thing where they wanted to make sure that there was conversation about it. And so they gave us a heads up on Friday. And I actually said to them, I think you should let people know. Yep. They were, I wouldn't say adamant, but they were insistent that that was not the best way to do this. And without them saying so, I just inferred that what we were looking at was something about the best practice way that they wanted to gain the information.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that towards the end of this too, because maybe the biggest thing that I want to explore with you is how this was actually handled, how it rolled out, and how fair or unfair that may have been. I think that's really the question on most people's mind at this point.
Yeah, so the question right now is, was this a one-off?
Right.
Is that the only time it's ever going to happen and we're done forever with this?
My, I think, deep suspicion is the answer to that is no.
Yeah.
It would be very strange if they felt like they'd gathered enough data to make a decision just on this one afternoon. I also think, given what I saw with these games, I don't even know the utility of the content that was put out there.
Yeah, I was disappointed and underwhelmed when I realized what the nature of what was going on. About 20 minutes after the first test takers started coming out, maybe it was a half hour or more, and we started hearing about it, I was like, I was hoping for something cool. Like they tested this weird new thing, and then I could, think about that as a possible future for the LSAT. Instead, it was all about survey questions on scratch paper, which was probably helpful for them, but for our purposes, in terms of trying to figure out what's coming next, not so helpful.
Yeah, man. I mean, when the world opens up to your imagination as to what this could have been, I was like, you have scratch paper, make them do origami. Like, to have some cool task. But no, it was just like logic games for kids.
That is never going to happen. Origami with your scratch paper.
Just seems fun.
Some people rip theirs into a million pieces, just to be petty about it.
Scratch paper confetti.
So let's talk about that one-time thing.
I don't think this was the last time. But so what do we know then going forward? Very little at this point, at least to my knowledge, to my awareness. I haven't seen them make any announcements on what happens in August or September or beyond. I don't have any information to think that this is a guarantee for the next set of digital people who roll into a coming weekend.
Yeah, I'd say there's two aspects of the one time. First off, in this test administration we're in right now, we're doing this podcast after the main administration, but prior to the paper and pencil and international test taking group. And that is because they will not get this research section. So this was a one-time test inside the June exam. It was only for Saturday test takers. Friday test takers did not receive this. So we're done for as far as June. It's not going to pop up again. So if you come down and you're having a retake in a week and a half too, you won't see it for that either. Now, the other kind of one time, like could it appear on other LSATs? I'm very much of the mind that we're going to see future sections like this, but they probably won't be the same. Won't be this simple. Next time we might see different questions. We might see new types of items. This was, I think, probably the first in what will be a series of intermittent tests. So if I'm taking August or September or October, the way I would think about this is I might see it. And maybe you might even think to yourself, I hope I see it. But you won't know that for sure until you get to that point in the start of section 4. And so you will just have to treat every section as real, just like you should anyway, and treat it like a normal LSAT. But I think we'll see more of this.
I agree. And I want to double down on a point you just made. You won't know it until you get to section 4. You said that with a degree of confidence that in this case is justified because they have told us, they've guaranteed, I hope they stick to it, that it will only ever be the final section, the 4th section. So if this does happen in August or September, you're not going to get this in section 2. It will be section 4 if you are one of the ones who gets it.
Yeah, and that's due to fairness issues. And if they started deviating from that, and of course it's their test, they can do what they want, I am quite confident that you and I will start squawking a lot about it because I would consider that. I already consider there to be some inherent unfairness in this process as it is. If it was section 1 or 2 or 3, I would start to think that now they've actually undermined the integrity of the entire test experience. That would be a problem for me.
So when we say it's always section 4, we're quoting them. I'd just be upset if they moved it because it means they lied to us.
I don't care about that. In fact, I don't know. I might even expect that to some extent.
I'm personally invested.
I'm not worried about that. My feelings don't matter here. It's the way it affects test takers. And
of course.
From a test taking standpoint, that would be a problem. At that point, it's protest time.
So that was the past. Talking more about the future. If you do encounter it, let's say someone sits in August and this just happens to pop up, or some other version, but the same announcement, section 4, it won't count. You may not get these little mini games. You might get something entirely different. But if you do encounter this situation, what would your advice for the person be?
Do it. Do the section. See exactly what they're doing. Try to learn a little bit about it, primarily so you have a good understanding of what's going on just around you. But secondarily, your participation in this actually helps your future law student friends. It may not affect your score. It may not affect anybody this year or even next year, but somebody in 2024, 2025, or 2026 might be benefited if you did a good job in terms of, trying to figure this out. They're clearly angling around the idea of how do we present things in a way that doesn't require scratch paper, but still requires this kind of like juggling of variables. And so an honest effort there, you're their guinea pig. Yeah, you're helping them, but really you're not. You're helping future students hopefully not get screwed by some new terrible testing format.
Yeah.
So that's how I would approach it.
I agree with you. I think it's just a fascinating sneak peek into what the future could hold, too. It's a bit of time travel, if you look at it that way. It may never affect you, but knowing what the test has in store, I just think that's kind of cool. As I said to you on Friday, when we found out this was going to happen and weren't allowed to talk about it, this is probably the most genuinely interested in taking a real LSAT that I've been in years. Because I was like, I want to experience this. I want to see what they're up to.
Yeah.
Now, it turns out I would have been deeply disappointed. But
as I was when I just started hearing what it was, the questions were, I was like,
as a prospect, though, it was intriguing.
No, it's just a situation where as you get into it, do your best on that section and see if it doesn't help somebody in the future. Learn as much about it because it's always good to be in the know on these types of things. And I would have to say that some of the accounts we heard of it were really helpful to us in understanding what it was that we were looking at, what we were talking about. So let's talk a little bit about the warning aspects or lack thereof. Because
this is where I wish I had a drink, actually.
What they did here, I understand, and I understand why they did it the way they did it, and I'm actually not going to complain too much about it. I may have thought that it would have been better if people just knew that it was a chance. Kind of like back a couple Julys ago when they knew that some of them were getting a paper version and some were getting an electronic version of the test. It's okay to give people some kind of heads up or warning about certain things. The way it worked out was this, is that a number of LSAT preparers, primarily people who speak to the public a lot, such as you and I, or people who run various forums like Reddit, our forum was one of them. LSAC contacted us in the days before this test and said, hey, we're going to do something unique. We need your help. And primarily what they wanted was during the time that it was occurring, they wanted a media blackout. So this didn't really affect us that much. Our forum, there's always comments people are making about the test. No one actually came on and made a comment about this. But on other forums, something like Reddit, a lot of people were coming on and making comments. And so What they wanted was those comments to be delayed or removed until a certain hour. And the hour that they wanted it delayed was actually 9 p.m. Eastern, which was when the last possible test taker would go in.
I will say on our forum, people were, again, I think there was some self-restraint in publicly posting, but I got a number of messages on there, and I was happy to engage with those. It was more about a public issue, I think, than an admission to the fact that it had happened at all. But what I found from a lot of people was this sense of almost like something weird has happened to me. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes when that happens, you're not necessarily inclined to go broadcast that. But like, am I the weird one here? Am I going crazy? Did anyone else have this? What made me special? I think that's how a lot of people felt because it was so unusual, so unexpected.
You and I started getting a stream of private messages. There's a number of emails that came into the main company channels as well. That was like, something odd just happened. And that was the usual reaction. Not that, oh, everybody just got this, but I've had a problem and certainly something out of the ordinary. And I need to know right now, was this normal or abnormal? And so I was sending people saying, yes, this was actually expected. It's a research section. It didn't count. It's all right. Which, again, I don't want to be customer service for LSAC. I love talking to students and certainly love the interesting stories that I hear, but this is where I was like, it would have really, in my opinion, been more interesting to have told people this was coming so that there wasn't that freak out moment, because that freak out moment's not fair. Nobody deserves that during the LSAT, even if that freak out is accompanied with, this isn't scored, so you can relax a little bit.
Yeah, all the messaging and disclaimers in the moment aside, there's only so much that can do. I saw this really as like this black box sandwich where we knew ahead of time, but no students were allowed to be informed or alerted. And then after the fact, no students were allowed to actually talk about it with each other or anyone publicly. So you had this just like perfect void of information on either side of it. I have pretty strong feelings that there are better ways to go about this.
Yeah, and it's probably not worth our time to debate, but of course, on Reddit, they ran a delay filter and let people know, hey, we want you to wait to talk about this particular topic. So when we got to 9 p.m. on Saturday, Eastern time, we posted that blog, for example, and then people started to have that discussion. And a lot of people had asked, well, why didn't they tell us beforehand? And, why did they lock it down during the actual testing window? And the reason is pretty simple. They didn't want you to know about it beforehand because they wanted you to have a cold reaction to it. They wanted to get kind of like that no heads up, no anticipation, fresh reaction to this to see exactly how people react in a live fire situation as far as the test. That, again, is part of the best practices way of trying to assess the genuineness of the responses as well as the truth or accuracy of those responses. And I understand that. And so from their perspective, it's almost like they follow a protocol where it's like, look, this isn't the way we look at it. This is an LSAC decision. This is a testing industry kind of baseline for how to do this.
A psychometric guideline.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly what happened in, I think, was it July 2019 when they introduced the paper versus the tablets. They gave it 50-50 and you didn't know beforehand. And they said, look, this is the way you do this. They've tested this in other exams. We're just following what are industry protocols.
But they did say some people will get one, others will get the other. We're just not going to say who's who until you're in the room.
Yeah.
That, again, I don't see what was prohibitive here. Yeah.
Could have.
Yeah. Sure. Instead, they wanted this candid camera moment where let's sneak up on them.
You just dated yourself. So
okay. I didn't mean the TV show.
Oh my God.
Kind of paparazzi pop out of a bush thing.
Exactly. What are you doing? How'd you feel about question number 2? Did you use your scratch paper? Mm-hmm. Was it helpful? How helpful was it? So that's really why they didn't warn it. And the reason they obviously warned us was so that we would actually be able to kind of explain it in the aftermath and, have kind of like a civil discussion about the reasons behind it. And as one student said posted in a comment on our blog, is like, I had no idea what happened. I found your blog and it made me feel better. And I was like, that's exactly why we posted it, because we wanted people to feel good about it. We spent a good part of Saturday putting those kinds of things together because we knew it would be an issue. Now, what?
Yeah, we sat on that blog and waited until 9:01 when it was allowed to be published.
Yeah, if you look at my Twitter, you'll see that it's at 9:01 Eastern, maybe 9:02 if I was a little slow. That's when I posted, all right, there was a crazy section today. And if there was any delay, it was because I was waiting for the blog to post. But the big issue that started to come out online in the aftermath of this was not so much the discussion of the censorship or the lack of warning about whether or not this was happening. The big issue was whether or not it was fair that some people got this unscored section notification and other people did not. And I think it's a really important conversation to have because you want your test to be fair. You want an experience that is even across the board. That's what standardized means inside standardized testing. And so when you have a deviation, the very first question is was that a reasonable deviation? Was it avoidable? I'm not sure it was in this case. And how much of a fairness impact did it actually have? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, setting aside the pre-test warning that I think you and I both agree could have at least occurred, the question really does become, as you say, did you get the same testing experience if you had 4 sections with no indication of what was experimental, all 4 presumably could have counted, versus if you had 3 sections, again, with no indication experimental or not, but then a 4th section where you knew it wouldn't count? You could essentially blow it off. Are those the same tests? Is that the same experience? And would the majority of people have a preference? Which I think also actually matters here. Not that people's preference indicate outcomes necessarily, but in this case, I do think they're indicative of a mentality or mindset, and those do affect outcomes.
They do. So let's talk a little bit about the way.
I know you asked my opinion, and all I did was elaborate on what you said.
That's okay. I mean, we'll get to the opinion part.
But yeah, I do have an opinion. Don't you worry.
No, you do. I know that, and you and I share the same opinion on this. So let's talk about it, because the very first thing that comes up is the idea of how the experimental works on this test and the positioning of it. The normal test taker goes in, they know they're getting an experimental, they just don't know where it's going to be. And it can be any one of the 4 sections. So you might start off the test and later on discover that didn't count. That can both be good and bad. If you crush that section, you're unhappy. You don't want to have to do it again and have it, have that not be scored. Whereas if you got crushed by that first section, maybe it was RC and it was really hard, then you're thrilled when you see another reading comp section come up later on. And just as an FYI, in the aftermath of this, I had people who were both happy to have received it and unhappy to have received it. So there was a mixed set of emotions.
Yeah, that unhappy group almost exclusively, from my take, were people who had performed poorly on one of their first 3 sections and were really hoping for some redemptive opportunity with a second version of it.
It was almost all that group of people. I had that on several occasions where somebody was like, I did not do well in my RC and I wanted another shot, or I wanted another LR and I was really hoping that's what I was going to get at the end. Because they know there's going to be a duplication at one point. So if you go through the first 3 sections and you have one of each type, you know now that whatever comes up next means that it's going to reveal its experimental self to you. It doesn't necessarily mean that section 4 is experimental, but it's going to reveal what your section type is as far as the experimental. If you're like, okay, I had LR first, then RC, and then LG, and then I get to the end and there's another LR, you're like, okay, it's either 1 or 4 that's experimental. That's the way the 50/50 information works. So, when you look at this, one of the things that comes up is that placement of the experimental is kind of important, because if you do it first, second, or third, you're using energy, and then later on you're doing the 4th section and your energy is lower, relatively speaking. And one of the complaints that people had was, hey, if you got to the 4th section, they told you it was experimental, you didn't have to expend more energy. You knew that everything was real and that ultimately you saved energy, whereas other people had to be doing the actual 4th section. So this is one of 2 criticisms, and we're kind of mixing up the issues, but
I think it's trackable, though. Let me rephrase that a little to put it this way. The question to me is really this: do people perform the same on the 4th section after 3 sections of honest attempts, or is the 4th section somehow affected negatively by 3 full sections of honest attempts? Because if it isn't, then who cares? If the 4th section could suffer by your efforts, and that 4th section doesn't count versus does, you have different outcomes.
Yeah, so it would be interesting to hear what LSAC would say about this.
I know what LSAC says about this.
Yes, so do I. And I'll tell you what they say right now. They say, and they have repeated this claim to me and others on multiple occasions, the placement of the experimental section does not matter. Doesn't matter whether it's first, second, third, or fourth. Scores are basically the same. They're independent of the placement of the experimental. And you and I have, for a long time, been skeptical of that claim. And, the reason's pretty simple. Watch somebody run a mile, and they go 4 times around the lap. Usually, the first lap is the fastest, then the second is a little bit less fast, the third is a little bit slower, and then the fourth is somewhere in a range, but it sometimes can be the slowest. And the reason is fatigue's kicking in. And your mind is just a muscle. If you sit there and do the same task over and over and over again without a break, which is what the LSAT really is, you're usually better in the first section, nerves aside, because you get going, you've got a lot of focus and energy. Well, after you've done 75 questions and now you got to do the last 25, you're getting tired. The logic and really, I would say, common sense analysis on whether or not experimental section position makes a difference would tend to suggest to you that, yeah, the later the section, the more kind of like the effect that it's going to have. Where the section is going to affect. If you have the first section as experimental, that should have a bigger negative effect than if you have the fourth section as experimental.
Exactly. I completely agree. And your runner analogy, I think, holds for normal runners. Professional runners keep a little gas in the tank for the kick. You look at like Bannister's sub 4-minute mile, and his fourth lap was his fastest.
Yeah, that's the one thing where, where people are actually doing it. But they've also spent years leveling out where they have that ability.
And speed is the thing there, as opposed to maybe aesthetics, or in this case, accuracy. That doesn't really come into place in it. So when I look at something like this, I just have to think people have to be suffering more at the fourth section than, say, the second. So where the placement of the experimental is, where you're going to actually penalize or reward them for their fatigue, must make a difference.
Yeah. Now, as we've said, LSAC strongly claims that that's not the case, and that they've controlled for all the other factors that might be out there, like section type and so forth. And my response to that continues to be, it sure doesn't seem to match up with common sense. So publish the research if you don't mind.
Let's see it.
Do that, and I'll feel a lot better about the whole situation, and we can stop having this conversation. But until then, I'm going to present both sides as being equally viable here, because they're the ones with the evidence, not us. We're just using common sense, and I like to rely on common sense most of the time. But in their situation, they have the evidence, publish it.
Yeah, if the data's out there, let's see it. We'll get off your back.
Okay, so that's one of the penalty possible situations here is that there's a fatigue factor here. And these people with a known unscored section fourth, their fatigue factor was removed from the equation. They knew the first 3 were real, whereas there were some other, I'll say this, poor suckers out there doing section 4, and it counted for them. So I feel like there's a disparity there that's a problem. There's another disparity too, John. What's that one?
Well, I would imagine it's the idea of like information, right?
Exactly.
That when you don't know, you're immediately at some kind of disadvantage versus those people who do.
What happens to most people who walk out of the LSAT is, okay, I had 2 RC. I really hope the hard one didn't count. Mm-hmm. In fact, that would really describe thousands of people from Friday.
Oh, yeah.
Thousands of people walked out of that test like, I know one of them was experimental, but I don't know which one. And now they're sitting in kind of like this personal feedback loop of hell where they're like, was it real? Was it not? They don't have full information about the test. Okay. And that's a disadvantage to me, no matter what the circumstances is, whether it's mental energy and anguish that's being expended, whether it's some student goes forward and they never learn which was experimental and they just kind of take a flyer on it. They're working with less than full information.
The fact is that would describe every student on Friday, because there's no clarity immediately after the test, as opposed, except for to type. It would describe every student in April, in March, in February, and every student who's had an experimental section since they expanded the flex, frankly.
But it does get exacerbated or aggravated if you have a real disparity in the two sections.
Yes, and I think reading comp, as we will cover in the episode to come here in a couple of days, is the most striking example of that. And Friday, my goodness.
Yeah. And so if you had two RCs that you're like, they're both the same, hey, it doesn't really hugely matter to you. But if one of them was way worse and you struggled versus another one which you felt you crushed, that lack of information, the lack of perfect information is now a real problem. People start to seek answers, or sometimes they make decisions without knowing, which is bad.
I'm sure there are plenty of people who are, lingering, debating over a cancellation right now, or sleeping poorly until we publicize our podcast. And there's this cloud of mystery that lingers until you and I tend to come and clear it up.
That's exactly right. And now consider the case of the people who had this research section. They're not living in that world. In fact, as soon as they hit Section 4 and accepted that it was, not a screw up by LSAC, they were now operating with perfect information. They knew that each of the first three sections they had taken was in fact real, and that the mystery of the experimental was gone for them. So they walked out with a marked and notable advantage in that situation.
Yeah.
And now, we don't have LSAC here to ask them about that. Because I think they would make the argument and say, look, by the time they got to that point, that, if let's say they had fourth experimental anyway, that would have always been the case. They just happened to find out at that moment. And, they're right. In those cases where someone else had Section 4 as experimental, it's all good. It's pretty much equal. But what about that kid who had experimental second? Then it's a little bit different. And that's where you start to see the points of differentiation. I understand their argument, and they're like, we had to do it this way to get the information that we wanted. But some people had different testing situations and different test information levels than others. That's indisputable.
Yeah, the clarity of this. I had one student actually message me yesterday, Sunday, and say one upside to all that extra time I had at the end of Section 4, since I knew it didn't count and I finished in like 15 minutes, is while the test was super fresh in my mind, I used my scratch paper to work out exactly my raw scores, what I thought it was. He's like, I remembered exactly how many questions I guessed on, flagged, how many I felt confident in. He's like, on my scratch paper, I had a tally of answers from the three sections I knew counted. He had that before he even left the test.
Which, by the way, you should always do that after every practice test and every real LSAT anyway. Give yourself an estimated raw score. I wrote a whole blog about how you can use practice tests to help predict your possible scored outcomes in order to avoid cancellation and uncertainty and so forth. So what that student was doing is 100% what we should be doing anyway. They just got to do it way earlier.
Accurate because he knew exactly what his three sections were during the test. And yeah, there is a huge advantage in being able to do that too. And he acted, I think, in the most tangible way on it.
And less confusion. You didn't have to shuffle through 8 passages of RC or 8 games or 50 LR. They knew exactly what was sitting there from the first 3 sections. So when people start saying this was unfair, I think, there's a number of instances where you could say that there is unfairness in here. Whether or not that was avoidable is really maybe the question that LSAC is most interested in. And they clearly felt that it was unavoidable. The way I would have done this, just in case anybody's interested, is I would have said, hey, let's take a whole small testing administration like February and just do this to all of them. So everybody who took the February LSAT had the same exact testing experience. I think they didn't want to do that because they like comparison points. And they would say, well, that's not the correct testing protocol. But you have plenty of LSATs floating around. You've tested a lot of these sections multiple times. You could figure it out. It's just a data exercise. I don't think that would pollute the data or subvert it in any meaningful way.
Yeah, I was thinking about a secondary, like a countermeasure that they could have employed here, which is for Saturday, as soon as they started putting this announced experimental fourth, everyone's experimental would be fourth. Even people who didn't get it, if you had double reading comp, 2 and 4, 4 is experimental. Double LR, 3 and 4, 4 is experimental. If everyone's was fourth, then we'd lose this potential discrepancy in the penalty of fatigue.
Notice Friday test takers would be mad at you, though, because now everyone on Saturday got a benefit.
I don't think there's any way to walk this all the way back to neutrality, but there are ways that I think you could get closer to it. And I will say this as well.
This is an important point for people going forward, is that if you're picking a test day in the future, they're very unlikely to run these kinds of tests on day one. they're much more likely to run it on the last day of the full test administration. Something to think about there. If you're like, well, I don't care what day I take it. It's like, well, do you want to have the possibility of this occurring? That would be the last test day, Saturday in our case. Do you not want to have to deal with this? Take Friday.
Since we're talking about this almost from a removed third-party perspective, I'm going to ask you one question, and maybe we can wrap up on this, Dave. Would you want this to have happened to you?
100%.
100%. Yeah,
I'm lazy, man.
Yeah, me too. I can't think of a better surprise.
If getting there, I'm like, okay, now I got to do this last section. I'm tired. I hope it's not some annoying RC section.
Yeah, God, please don't be another reading comp.
You want to use me as a guinea pig? Fun. I would be like all into it. I would be elated for this to occur.
And maybe that says everything people need to know.
Maybe that really is the truth. Because when the experts who love the test are like, this would be great to have happen, and maybe it might actually be prejudicial. Anything else to add, Jon?
Only that as much as I feel for the students who have to be part of these transitions underway, the seismic shifts beneath your feet that you can't really observe from a distance because you're in the middle of it. I think it is noble and exciting that they're trying to at least get enough information and do something that ultimately should make the test more equitable and more fair for people who, I think you and I would also agree, have been penalized to certain degrees by it in the past. So this isn't entirely like a bash session. I'll hat tip to that.
Yeah, in a sense, maybe some people who took the test on Saturday were disadvantaged in a minor way so that some people in the future can have a more systemic disadvantage removed from the situation. In that context, it doesn't seem so bad.
I think that's as fair as we're going to get on this, buddy. Curious to see what happens next. But for now,
the next episode will actually be us talking about the June 2022 tests in specific. We'll touch on this briefly, but now that we've done this, now we don't have to spend a half hour in that episode doing it. And on that note, we'll call it a day. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. If you've enjoyed it, please leave a comment and rating as well. If you have any questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscored.com. On behalf of Jon and myself, we'll talk to you soon.